Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like and subscribe and to leave a comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing right now. Now, with that said, let's get down to business because we've got a ton of history content to cover. If you'd stepped into a refined English drawing room in 1800, you'd likely have encountered a sight that seemed to defy the very laws of biological physics. Hanging prominently within a heavy, gilded frame, a creature that was supposedly a pig or sheep or a cow didn't look like a living animal at all, but rather like a breathing brick of meat. Its body was rendered as a perfect rectangle, a sharp-edged block of muscle and fat so massive that the four spindly legs supporting it looked as if they might snap at any moment. These oat-stuffed animals weren't the result of an artistic blunder or a painter who'd never visited a farm. Instead, they were carefully constructed status symbols, the visual manifestos of an agricultural revolution that was reshaping the British landscape. This era of rectangular livestock painting was a profound display of power, wealth, and a radical new way of conceptualizing the natural world as something to be engineered for profit. Also, if you're one of those people who tends to just listen to my videos, there's a lot of interesting art from the time period here that you're going to want to see. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a period of frantic change for Britain. As the Industrial Revolution shifted into high gear, the population of urban centers exploded, and all those factory workers needed a reliable source of food. This created a massive, lucrative market for meat, milk, and tallow. In response, a new class of landowner emerged, known as the improvers. These weren't traditional farmers who were content with the methods of their ancestors. They were scientific tinkerers who viewed livestock as biological machines that could be refined for maximum output. They believed that through rigorous intervention and selective breeding, they could create animals that grew faster and fatter than anything nature had originally intended. To these men, a perfectly square cow was tangible proof that they'd mastered the science of breeding and had successfully bent the biological world to their will. This obsession with size was framed as much more than just a way to generate wealth. It was presented to the public as a profound patriotic duty. With the nation frequently engaged in costly conflicts and the domestic population rising, food security was a major political concern. Elite farmers argued that by developing these gargantuan meat mountains, they were providing a vital service to the entire country. They claimed that their experiments in creating massive cattle would eventually trickle down to smaller, more modest farmers. This in turn would lead to a more productive agricultural system that would benefit everyone from the monarchy to the common laborer. Some animals were even given names like Patriot to emphasize this connection between a farmer's breeding success and his devotion to the British crown. When an artist captured a cow as a perfect rectangle, they were painting a portrait of a national hero, a fleshy pillar of British prosperity and industrial progress. There was a very cold, calculated economic reason for the preference for such extreme fatness. In a world before electric lights and modern synthetic lubricants, animal fat, specifically tallow, was a critical industrial resource. It was used to produce the candles that lit every home and provided the essential grease for the heavy machinery that powered the nation's factories. It's estimated that the fat from a single prize-winning animal could sometimes be worth significantly more than the meat itself. Breeders were incentivized to produce animals that could pack on as much fat as possible, and the rectangular shape was considered the most efficient container for that weight. A square silhouette signaled that the animal was carrying the maximum amount of high-value tallow along its back and sides. The geometry was a visual code for the financial value of truly industrial livestock. The most famous figure in this era of agricultural spectacle was undoubtedly the Durham ox. Born in 1796 and bred by the Calling brothers, this bull became a genuine national celebrity. Eventually purchased by a traveling showman named John Day, the ox was taken on an epic tour across England and Scotland that lasted for 5 years. Day even had a custom-made carriage built to move the massive animal, which was reported to weigh nearly 3,000 pounds. Everywhere they went, crowds of people paid for the privilege of seeing this monstrous creature in person. The ox's image was reproduced in thousands of prints and engravings, which were sold as souvenirs. These images were so popular that they were even used as patterns for dinner plates. This in turn allowed families to literally eat their meals off the likeness of the greatest representative of the world's most famous beef producer. Not to be outdone, the Craven heifer became another legendary figure in the early 1800s. Born in 1807 on a grand estate in Yorkshire, she was fed relentlessly until she reached record-breaking proportions. She remains the largest cow ever shown in England, weighing over 4,000 pounds. Like the Durham ox, she was taken on tour, a journey that was so slow and difficult, it took 73 days just to travel from Wakefield to London. She was so wide that her owners had to build a special doorway for her cowshed that was twice the normal size just so she could get in and out. These celebrity animals were subjected to a strange life of extreme pampering, mixed with the grueling physical strain of constant travel and public exhibition. The artists who created these iconic paintings were often provincial or itinerant specialists who moved from one grand estate to another. These artists who were commissioned to put these meat castles to canvas weren't looking for the approval of high-minded art critics in London or Paris. They were working for practical-minded landowners who wanted an accurate, if idealized, record of their achievements. These painters were effectively creating trophies that their owners could hang on their walls to announce their success to any visitor. The influence of these images wasn't confined to the walls of manor houses. Thanks to new printing technologies, the images of celebrity animals entered the homes of the growing middle class. Pottery manufacturers began producing vast quantities of dinnerware featuring these livestock portraits. Owning a platter with the image of a famous meat rectangle was a way for a family to show that they were modern, patriotic, and aligned with the ideals of progress. The dining table became a place where status was displayed not just by the food being served, but by the very dishes it was served on. This mass distribution helped to cement the rectangular aesthetic as a defining visual symbol of the era, making the square cow a recognizable icon across the entire country. But unfortunately, there's a very dark side to this pursuit of geometric perfection that was often overlooked in the celebratory atmosphere of the time. The extreme selective breeding and intensive feeding required to create these massive animals took a devastating toll on their health. These so-called improved creatures were often so heavy that they could barely move, their delicate legs struggling under the weight of bodies that had been engineered for sheer volume. The short lifespans of animals like the Durham ox and the Craven heifer were a direct result of the physiological strain their bodies were put under. For the breeders, these were the necessary sacrifices in the name of progress and national food security. The paintings capture a moment of triumph for biological engineering, but they also record a period of profound suffering that was justified by the economic needs of the time. As the 19th century wore on, the fashion for rectangular livestock began to fade. The science of agriculture became more refined, and breeders started to prioritize traits like efficiency and meat quality over sheer visible bulk. At the same time, the art world moved toward a more naturalistic style, and the portraits of itinerant painters were replaced by more realistic depictions of rural life. The silence of a Russian winter at the turn of the 20th century wasn't just a matter of quiet nights. In certain pockets of the Pskov region, It was a silence that reportedly swallowed entire families for months at a time. Picture a timber hut, its windows sealed with thick ice and its door banked with drifting snow, where the only sign of life is a faint rhythmic breathing from atop a massive stone stove. There's no smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, and no tracks in the yard. This isn't a tragic scene, though, far from it. According to reports that captivated the medical world in 1900, it was a calculated strategy for survival. For nearly half the year, these peasants allegedly entered a state of semi-dormancy, a human echo of the deep sleep found in the animal kingdom. The primary evidence for this extraordinary behavior comes from a report published in the British Medical Journal in 1900. This report claimed to detail a practice allegedly common in the Peskov government of northwestern Russia. The claim suggested that the local peasantry, faced with a chronic state of famine and an annual scarcity of resources, had developed a method called latska. This was, the report claimed, a common Russian word that would be recognized in many of the most frigid regions of this vast continent-spanning empire. When the first snow fell in November, entire families would gather around their large masonry stoves, lie down, and effectively withdraw from the world until the spring thaw in April. The account noted that because the agricultural yield wasn't sufficient to sustain active life throughout the winter, they chose to enter a deep metabolic sleep. In the original report, this was framed as a widespread cultural practice, and not a response to a specific famine or mass starvation event. They didn't sleep for months on end without waking, but rather, they existed in a state of extreme lethargy, which would put a sloth to shame. Once a day, the family members would rouse themselves just enough to consume a single piece of hard bread, dipped in water. They took turns staying awake for brief periods to ensure the fire in the stove didn't go out, as the warmth was their only shield against the Arctic air. When examining the historical truth behind latska, researchers are immediately met with a significant linguistic hurdle: the word itself. Modern Russian speakers have pointed out that latska isn't a recognized term in the Russian language. This has led some to suspect the original 1900 report was a hoax or a result of deep cross-cultural confusion. However, a closer look at regional dialects suggests the word might have been a transcription error for lezhka, which translates to the process of lying down. This term would accurately describe the act of hunkering down for the winter. The fact that Western journals like the New York Times and the British Medical Journal reportedly carried the story independently suggests there was some underlying administrative source. There was likely an official report from the Russian Bureau of Statistics in the Department of Peskov detailing a similar phenomenon. Unfortunately, as is generally the case in Russian history, things would get worse, and records would be lost or destroyed. The credibility of the latska claim is tied to the dire economic reality of the Russian Empire in the late 19th century. Region-specific studies show that areas like Peskov suffered from chronic famine, where crop failures weren't occasional tragedies, but an annual expectation. The 1891 to 1892 famine was particularly devastating, resulting in an estimated 500,000 deaths and exposing the extreme fragility of the peasant economy. In such an environment, reducing physical activity to almost zero wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. Since these communities primarily generated resources through farming, there was little incentive to work during the frozen months when the soil was impenetrable. According to this theory, as soon as the outside world was warm enough to permit agricultural tasks, the peasants would wake up and return to their regular labor. The central technological component of this winter sleep was the Russian stove, or pech. This massive masonry structure wasn't just for cooking. It was the thermal heart of the home, designed to retain heat for extended periods. The top of the stove was a flat, warm area used specifically for sleeping. Traditional Russian huts featured raised wooden platforms extending from the stove to the walls. These platforms allowed entire families to sleep together in the warmest part of the house, using their collective body heat and the stove's thermal mass to survive the cold. While this proves that it was theoretically possible to largely sleep all winter with little time awake, the biological reality suggests something quite different. From a medical perspective, the idea of 6 months of bed rest is fraught with danger. Modern studies on the effects of immobilization show that humans quickly suffer from muscle atrophy, bone density loss, and cardiovascular deconditioning. Without physical activity, the heart's ability to maintain blood pressure decreases, often leading to fainting when a person eventually tries to stand. Furthermore, humans don't possess the biological machinery for anything approaching true hibernation. True hibernators, such as bears or marmots, can lower their body temperature and metabolic rate by significant margins, often surviving on internal fat stores for months. The Latska practice, if it existed, was likely not a state of hibernation, but of extreme starvation-induced lethargy. If the peasants were indeed surviving on just a single piece of bread daily along with some water, they would have been in a state of severe malnutrition. Despite what the original article claimed, it appears that this wasn't a cultural tradition or anything approaching hibernation. Rather, it may have been a localized response by these peasants, using the equipment they had that allowed them to increase their chances of survival during a famine. Russia wasn't the only place where these claims surfaced, and there's unsubstantiated claims that peasants in the Alps and the Pyrenees employed similar strategies. Similar stories also exist in Inuit culture, especially in Greenland, where people supposedly slept through the entire winter. However, it remains unclear whether these claims are embellished or symbolic oral traditions, or based on actual historical events. In the end, the historical Latska may be more myth than science, but the concept continues to fascinate the public and historians alike. In general, the consensus for the time being is that what the British medical report was describing was a mechanism to combat mass starvation. It may have been something that was employed during the absolute worst winters of a famine, but it was by no means the routine practice that some claim it to be today. Hey everyone, before we go on, just hitting you with a quick reminder to tap that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't done so already. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to take your support to the next level. In the mid-19th century, scientists faced a riddle that defied easy explanation. They had found fossils of lemurs, small, monkey-like primates, in India. Living lemurs, however, were solely concentrated on the island of Madagascar, thousands of miles away. The strangest part was that there was no trace of them, living or fossilized, in the vast intervening lands of mainland Africa or the Middle East. In a world that didn't yet understand plate tectonics, this biogeographical puzzle left scientists baffled. In 1864, a respected British zoologist named Philip Lutley Scalater offered a solution. In a paper titled The Mammals of Madagascar, he proposed that a vast continent must have once existed in the Indian Ocean, connecting India and Madagascar. This massive land bridge would have allowed the lemurs to migrate freely. After it served its evolutionary purpose, he theorized, this landmass sank beneath the waves. He gave this hypothetical continent a fitting name, Lemuria. It was a simple, logical, and elegant scientific hypothesis. It was also completely wrong. But the idea Scalater unleashed was far too powerful to be undone by mere facts. His thought had just been born, and it was about to begin one of the strangest journeys in the history of ideas. And trust me, This hypothesis about lemurs would go to some very crazy and very non-lemur related places really quickly. It's important to understand that Scalator's idea wasn't fringe for its time. It was actually considered quite brilliant and progressive. In the Victorian era, proposing sunken continents and land bridges was a perfectly respectable scientific tool. Without an understanding of continental drift, geologists and biologists use these geographies to explain all sorts of anomalies in rock formations and species distribution across the globe. Scalator, a serious and prolific zoologist, was just engaging in standard scientific practice. But his idea was quickly adopted and radically transformed by another more famous scientist. Ernst Haeckel, a prominent German biologist, was a fierce advocate for Darwin's new theory of evolution. Haeckel was obsessed with finding the missing link, the fossil evidence of a proto-human that would bridge the gap between apes and modern Homo sapiens. The embarrassing lack of such fossils was a major vulnerability for the theory. Haeckel seized upon Scalator's Lemuria as the perfect solution. In his 1876 book, The History of Creation, he proposed that Lemuria was not just a bridge for lemurs, but the very cradle of humanity. Also, I miss the days when scientists and historians could unironically name their works, The History of Creation, and just run with it. But I digress. His reasoning was simple. If humanity evolved on a continent that was now at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, it would perfectly explain why we couldn't find any fossils. In his maps, Haeckel confidently labeled this sunken landmass Eden and showed the various human races migrating from this single origin point to populate the rest of the globe. With Haeckel's influential backing, Lemuria made its first great pivot. It was no longer a niche zoological hypothesis, but a grand theory of human origins. Haeckel's scientific stamp of approval made Lemuria irresistible to a group that had no interest in lemurs, but a profound interest in lost cradles of humanity. This is where the myth truly took flight, thanks to one of the 19th century's most enigmatic and influential figures, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky was the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, a mystical religious movement that blended Eastern philosophy with Western esotericism. In her 1888 magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, she unveiled a complex and sweeping history of the cosmos and humanity's evolution. But Blavatsky's Lemurians were nothing like Scalator's primates or Haeckel's missing links. They were giants, described as standing 12 to 15 feet tall. They were androgynous or hermaphroditic, laid eggs, and possessed a third eye in the back of their heads, which gave them psychic abilities. This was the myth's most important transformation. Blavatsky and the Theosophists had successfully severed Lemuria from any testable scientific claim. Its history was no longer accessible through geology or fossil hunting, but only through clairvoyant readings of the Akashic records. The hypothesis had become an article of faith, making it completely immune to any future scientific debunking. But back to Scalator's original puzzle. Science did eventually find the answer, and it was just as fantastic as Lemuria, but true. The theory of continental drift, or plate tectonics, which was proposed in 1912 and finally accepted in the 1960s, rendered the Lemuria hypothesis obsolete. Notably, when German geophysicist Alfred Wegener proposed this theory, his ideas were considered completely non-scientific. Interestingly, the new theory confirmed that Scalator's observation was correct. Madagascar and India had been connected. But they weren't a continent that sank. They were part of the ancient supercontinent Gondwanaland. They didn't sink. They drifted apart. The fatal flaw in Scalator's theory was the timeline. The breakup that separated India from Madagascar occurred roughly 80 to 90 million years ago. This was millions of years before the first lemurs or any other primates had even evolved. They couldn't have walked across a land bridge. The real solution to the riddle of the lemurs is believed to be oceanic dispersal. Scientists theorize that millions of years ago, a small group of ancestral lemurs was swept out to sea from mainland Africa, perhaps on a large mat of vegetation during a storm. By a 1 in a billion chance, they survived the 560-kilometer journey and landed on the isolated island of Madagascar, where, free from competition, they evolved. By the time science provided this definitive, evidence-based answer, it didn't matter. The myth of Lemuria had long since escaped the laboratory.